San Luis Obispo, California. The early morning hours of May 25, 1996, Memorial Day weekend. 19-year-old Kristen Smart, a freshman at California Polytechnic State University, had spent the evening at an off-campus party with friends. The exact kind of loose, unremarkable college gathering that happens on 1,000 campuses every single weekend of the school year, full of the ordinary noise and momentum of a long holiday weekend finally starting. At some point that night, other students found her passed out on a neighboring lawn, not falling down drunk by most accounts, just tired enough that a friend needed to help her back on her feet, the kind of small, common stumble that ends 100,000 college parties every year without any lasting consequence at all. A fellow freshman named Paul Flores, who'd spent part of the evening flirting with her, at one point even falling against her in a way witnesses would later describe, volunteered to walk her home to her dorm, the kind of offer that, on the surface, looked like nothing more than one classmate helping another get home safely. Another student, Cheryl Anderson, walked with them for part of the way, before splitting off at the intersection of Perimeter Road and Grand Avenue, leaving Kristen and Paul Flores alone together for the final stretch back to campus housing, sometime around 2 in the morning, on a walk that, under any other circumstances, would have taken only a few unremarkable minutes. Kristen Smart was never seen again. Before we go any further into what happened over the following 25 years, I want you to understand who Kristen actually was, because a case this thoroughly consumed by decades of investigation and appeals can sometimes lose the actual 19-year-old at its center. She'd grown up in Stockton, California, and had just finished her very first year away from home, the exact stage of life where an entire adult identity is still forming, still half improvised, full of new friends and late parties, and the specific electric freedom of being on your own for the first time. She was tall, by most accounts around 6 feet 1 inch, blonde, and by every description left behind, exactly the kind of ordinary, likable college freshman whose disappearance felt, to everyone who knew her, completely impossible to reconcile with the person they'd actually known. She'd chosen Cal Poly specifically, the way so many first-generation college students choose their schools, for the promise of a fresh start somewhere new. A chance to become whoever she was going to become, away from the town she'd grown up in, surrounded by new people who had no pre-existing idea of who she was supposed to be. She was, in the truest sense, a young woman from an era before smartphones, before campus-wide emergency text alerts, before any of the safety infrastructure a modern college freshman might now take entirely for granted. Walking home from a party the way an entire generation of students before and after her has done without a second thought. When Kristen didn't turn up over the following days, it took a friend, not immediate family, to formally set the investigation in motion. Since her parents lived hours away in Stockton and had no immediate way of knowing anything was wrong at all. On May 27th, 2 days after the party, a student named Jennifer Phipps called Cal Poly police to report her missing. Remarkably, that initial call didn't immediately produce a formal report. Phipps called again the following day, this time reaching the San Luis Obispo Police Department directly, and was redirected back to the university's own police force, who finally opened an official missing persons case. The very first moment Kristen's own parents, Stan and Denise, learned anything at all was wrong with their daughter. That same day, investigators interviewed Paul Flores for the first time. He told a campus officer that he and Kristen had simply separated near Santa Lucia Hall, one of the dormitory buildings, and that he hadn't seen her since. A version of events that would remain, in its essential shape, his consistent account for the next quarter century. It's worth pausing on the timing of what happened next, because it's one of the stranger, more unsettling details buried inside this case's earliest days. On May 27th, the exact same day Jennifer Phipps first called police to report Kristen missing, Paul Flores turned himself in to the Arroyo Grande Police Department, entirely unrelated to Kristen's case, on an outstanding warrant connected to a DUI charge. The booking photo taken that day appears to show him with a black eye. I want to sit with that image for a second, because I think about it more than almost any other single detail in this entire case. A black eye, on the exact same day his classmate's disappearance was first being reported to police, captured permanently in an official booking photograph that had nothing directly to do with Kristen at all, and everything, potentially, to do with what had actually happened during those final unaccounted for minutes after Cheryl Anderson split off and left the two of them alone. It's the kind of detail that could mean absolutely nothing, an unrelated scuffle from an unrelated night. And it's also the kind of detail that, once you know the rest of this story, is almost impossible to look at without immediately wondering what actually caused it. Nobody has ever definitively answered that question. The photograph simply exists, filed away in an unrelated DUI case, waiting decades for anyone to notice how strangely its timing lined up with everything else. Investigators spent that first summer working the case methodically, moving through the same small campus community that had, only weeks earlier, been consumed by nothing more serious than final exams and end-of-year parties. On June 5th, they searched Kristen's own dormitory room, seizing its contents for safekeeping, an early, almost instinctive step to preserve whatever traces of her ordinary daily life might eventually matter to the investigation. On June 10th, they went to search Paul Flores' dorm room, only to discover that the semester had already ended and the room had been completely cleaned out, emptied of anything that might have connected him directly to what happened that night. The ordinary rhythm of an academic calendar having unintentionally erased potential evidence before anyone in law enforcement had thought to move fast enough to preserve it. It wasn't until a second search, during the weekend of June 29th, that investigators brought in cadaver dogs, specially trained to detect the specific scent of human decomposition, and those dogs signaled, unmistakably, inside that same dorm room, more than a month after it had already been vacated and cleaned by maintenance staff moving through the building for the summer. That single detail, a trained cadaver dog alerting to the scent of decomposition inside the dorm room belonging to the last person seen with a missing 19-year-old, would become one of the earliest, most persistent pieces of circumstantial evidence hanging over Paul Flores for the next 25 years. It wasn't enough on its own to charge him with anything. It was more than enough to make him, officially, by July of 1996, first a key witness, and then, permanently, the case's central person of interest. What followed was nearly a quarter-century of a case that everyone in San Luis Obispo seemed to understand the shape of, without anyone ever being able to actually prove it in court. A strange, extended limbo where a small college town collectively believed it already knew the answer, and simply had to wait, year after year, for the legal system to eventually catch up to that belief. Kristen's parents filed a $40 million wrongful death civil lawsuit against Flores directly, a route families sometimes pursue, specifically because the burden of proof in civil court is considerably lower than in a criminal case, requiring only a preponderance of the evidence rather than proof beyond a reasonable doubt. During a deposition connected to that lawsuit in November of 1997, the Smart family's attorney asked Flores a long series of questions, starting with something as simple as his own parents' names and where they worked. Questions that had nothing inherently incriminating about them at all. Flores refused to answer. Over the course of that single deposition, he invoked his Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination 27 separate times, refusing to answer even the most basic, seemingly harmless questions about his own life, reading the same practiced legal phrase back at his questioner again and again, question after question, for hours. I think that number, 27, deserves a moment of its own. This wasn't a man declining to answer one or two genuinely dangerous questions, the kind of narrow, targeted silence a nervous witness might reasonably choose around a specific, sensitive topic. This was someone who had apparently decided, on the advice of counsel, that the safest possible position was total, blanket silence, even about his own parents' employment, even about details a genuinely uninvolved person would have no conceivable reason to fear discussing at all. It's the kind of pattern that, without ever constituting proof of anything on its own in a court of law, tends to leave an unmistakable impression on anyone watching it unfold. The sense of a person who has decided, permanently and completely, that silence is simply safer than any version of the truth. Investigators returned to search Flores family properties repeatedly over the following years, each search generating renewed hope and, almost without exception, renewed disappointment. In June of 2000, sheriff's deputies and FBI evidence response teams searched the Arroyo Grande backyard belonging to Susan Flores, Paul's mother, arriving with cadaver dogs, ground-penetrating equipment, and a search warrant that carried real legal weight behind it. The warrant they carried technically allowed them to dig up that backyard entirely. They chose not to, opting for a less invasive search instead. For a family that had already waited 4 years for any kind of resolution, watching investigators arrive with the legal authority to finally excavate and then decide against it landed, in the words of one family representative years later, as an absolutely crushing disappointment. One more moment of being almost there, only to have the actual answer slip away again. The gap between what the law technically permitted and what investigators actually chose to do, becoming its own small, agonizing wound, layered on top of the original one. During that same period, another small but genuinely striking piece of evidence surfaced. An earring found in the driveway of Susan Flores' home, one that appeared to match jewelry Kristen had been wearing the night she disappeared, visible in the exact photograph the Smart family had used on missing person billboards posted around the county for years. A single earring in a driveway, tying together a piece of physical evidence with an image that had been staring back at the entire community from roadside billboards for years. A small, easily overlooked object that somehow ended up carrying more evidentiary weight than almost anything else recovered in the case's first decade. In 2007, as part of ongoing discovery in the family's civil lawsuit, legal teams searched a small portion of Susan Flores' backyard using ground-penetrating radar, technology capable of detecting disturbances in soil consistent with a burial site without requiring a full excavation. They found nothing conclusive. In 2016, 20 years after Kristen vanished, investigators excavated a hillside on Cal Poly's own campus, chasing yet another lead that, once again, failed to produce her remains. Another expensive, hopeful search effort ending in the same quiet, familiar disappointment that had followed almost every previous attempt across 2 full decades. Before we go further, I want to know who's sitting with this story tonight. If you're watching, drop your country and the time where you are down in the comments. I think about how a single missing college freshman from 1996 has ended up being discussed, decades later, by people scattered across dozens of countries who were barely born, or not born at all, when Kristen Smart first disappeared. Her name traveling further and lasting longer than almost anyone involved in that original 1996 investigation could have ever predicted. Just your country and your time, and then let's talk about the moment that finally, after 23 years of dead ends, cracked this case wide open, because it didn't come from a lab, or a new witness stepping forward, or a lucky break during a routine search. It came from a podcast. In 2019, a Cal Poly alumnus named Chris Lambert launched an independent investigative podcast called Your Own Backyard, digging back through decades of court records, old interviews, and case history, presenting the entire unresolved timeline of Kristen's disappearance to a public audience in a level of granular, sustained detail the original news coverage from 1996 had never approached. Episode by episode, Lambert walked listeners through evidence that had been sitting in public court records for years, connecting details that had never quite been assembled into a single, coherent narrative for the general public before. The podcast became enormously popular, generating exactly the kind of renewed public pressure and fresh tips that a genuinely cold 23-year-old missing persons case desperately needed, reaching an audience of true crime listeners far beyond San Luis Obispo County, who had never previously heard Kristen Smart's name at all. It's a strange, distinctly modern way for a case like this to move forward. An independent podcaster doing archival research from outside any official investigation. And yet it worked in a way 23 years of official effort alone hadn't quite managed to replicate. That same year, in 2019, a retired detective named Clint Cole became the case's new lead investigator, arriving at almost exactly the moment renewed public attention was giving the investigation fresh momentum it hadn't had in years. A genuine convergence of institutional persistence and grassroots public pressure landing, by coincidence or not, at nearly the same moment. In January of 2020, investigators searched 2 vehicles connected to the Flores family, quietly building toward whatever final piece of evidence they still needed before moving toward an arrest. And then, on April 13, 2021, nearly 25 years to the exact season Kristen disappeared, Paul Flores was arrested at his home in San Pedro, California, on suspicion of murder. His father, Ruben Flores, was arrested the same day at his home in Arroyo Grande, accused of being an accessory after the fact, of helping his son hide Kristen's body. At a press conference following the arrests, the San Luis Obispo County Sheriff told reporters that investigators had discovered something of value connected to Kristen at 2 separate searched locations, while cautioning that the search for her actual remains was still ongoing, careful not to overstate what had actually been recovered, even in a moment of genuine, long-awaited progress. Investigators had located what they described as a clandestine grave beneath the deck of Ruben Flores's Arroyo Grande home. A hidden burial site they believed had, at some point, held Kristen's body before it was moved elsewhere entirely. The physical evidence of decomposition detected there, even though her remains themselves were no longer present. Neither man, according to the sheriff, said anything of consequence at the moment of arrest. Paul Flores was 44 years old at the time, no longer the college freshman who had walked Kristen home a quarter century earlier, but a middle-aged man who had spent his entire adult life, from his early 20s through his 40s, carrying whatever knowledge he actually had about that night in complete, unbroken silence. The trial that followed was moved out of San Luis Obispo County entirely, relocated to Monterey County, roughly 110 miles north, after the defense successfully argued that a quarter century of local notoriety made a fair trial in their own community essentially impossible, a place where jurors were far less likely to have already formed an opinion shaped by 25 years of local newspaper coverage, missing person billboards, and a wildly popular true crime podcast. Paul and Ruben Flores were tried simultaneously, with 2 separate juries hearing the same evidence side by side across 11 weeks of testimony, an unusual legal arrangement that allowed prosecutors to present a single unified case while still respecting the different legal standards each man's specific charges required. Prosecutors built their case around witness accounts placing Flores alone with Kristen in the final minutes before she vanished, around the earring found in his mother's driveway, around the cadaver dog alert in his dorm room, and around the 27-year pattern of silence and legal maneuvering that had followed, stitching together decades of circumstantial evidence into a single, cohesive narrative for a jury that hadn't lived through any of it as it originally unfolded. They also introduced testimony from 2 separate women who described being drugged and sexually assaulted by Flores in the years after Kristen's disappearance. Uncharged incidents admitted as evidence specifically to establish a pattern of behavior the prosecution argued was directly relevant to understanding what had likely happened to Kristen herself. Testimony the defense fought hard, ultimately unsuccessfully, to keep out of the trial entirely. The jury deliberated and, in October of 2022, convicted Paul Flores of first-degree murder, finding specifically that he had killed Kristen Smart while committing or attempting to commit rape. His father, Ruben Flores, was found not guilty of the accessory charge. The jury, apparently unconvinced that hiding the body, whatever role the clandestine grave beneath his deck had actually played, had been proven beyond reasonable doubt to be something he'd knowingly participated in. At sentencing in March of 2023, the judge overseeing the case described Paul Flores in blunt, uncompromising terms, calling him a cancer to society before formally sentencing him to 25 years to life in prison, with a requirement that he register as a sex offender for the remainder of his life, a formal legal marker that would follow him permanently, regardless of how much of that 25-year minimum he ultimately served. Kristen's father, Stan Smart, spoke to reporters afterward with a specific, aching kind of honesty that I think captures something essential about cases like this one: the particular way a legal verdict and genuine emotional closure so rarely arrive together, no matter how long a family has waited for both. He said plainly that the family still didn't have closure because they still didn't have their daughter, not even her remains. A sentence, he said, is a sentence. It doesn't bring back the person you lost. He added that the case, in the family's view, still wasn't truly over, because the search for Kristen's actual body was expected to continue, a search that, as of this telling, has still not produced her. Paul Flores has not had an easy time in prison since his sentencing. He's been the target of at least 2 separate attacks by fellow inmates at Pleasant Valley State Prison. One slashed across the neck badly enough to require hospitalization, and once again stabbed during a later altercation in the prison yard. Both incidents investigated as attempted homicides in their own right, speaking to exactly how other incarcerated people have chosen to treat a man convicted of murdering a college freshman during an attempted rape. Prison staff recovered makeshift weapons after at least one of the attacks, and Flores was transported to outside medical facilities both times before eventually being returned to the general population. His legal team continued pursuing appeals for years afterward, arguing that prejudicial evidence had been improperly admitted at trial, specifically challenging the decision to allow testimony about the uncharged assaults against the 2 other women, and arguing separately that a juror who had reportedly lost her ability to remain neutral partway through the trial should have been removed by the court. In January of 2026, the California Supreme Court denied his final appeal, cementing the conviction permanently, closing off what had been his last realistic legal avenue for overturning the verdict, nearly 30 years after Kristen first disappeared from that Cal Poly campus. There is something genuinely singular about how this case actually got solved, and I think it's worth naming directly, because it doesn't fit the usual shape true crime stories tend to take on this channel. This wasn't cracked open by a DNA match pulled from a public genealogy database, or by a discarded napkin at a diner, or by a jailhouse informant. It was cracked open, in large part, by an ordinary alumnus with a microphone and a genuine, sustained curiosity about a case his own community had spent 23 years quietly, collectively refusing to forget. Someone with no badge, no subpoena power, and no formal investigative authority whatsoever, simply reading through decades of public court records and asking, out loud, in a recorded format thousands of strangers could listen to, the exact questions that a genuinely engaged community had apparently been asking privately, among themselves, for years. Official law enforcement had the case file the entire time. What eventually broke through wasn't a new piece of forensic technology or some previously undiscovered witness. It was renewed public attention, generated independently outside any official investigation entirely, arriving at almost exactly the moment a new detective was ready to receive it, willing to look at old evidence with fresh eyes precisely because an audience of strangers online was suddenly paying close, sustained attention to a case that had quietly stopped generating headlines years earlier. I think about that combination often. Institutional persistence on one side, 25 years of a sheriff's department that never formally closed the file, never stopped periodically revisiting old evidence, even during the years when nothing new seemed to be happening, alongside grassroots, almost accidental public pressure on the other. A podcast built by someone with no formal investigative authority at all, working entirely from documents that had been sitting in public record rooms the whole time. Neither one, on its own, had managed to solve this case across 2 full decades of overlapping parallel effort. Together, arriving at nearly the same moment, they finally did, in a way that feels, even now, almost accidental, 2 entirely separate forces converging on the same conclusion within months of each other after 23 years of running in parallel without quite meeting. Kristen Smart was 19 years old. She'd finished her very first year of college, gone to an ordinary end-of-year party over a long holiday weekend, and never made it the rest of the way back to her dorm room, a walk of only a few hundred yards that should have taken her, on any other night, less time than it takes to describe it now. For 25 years, the man who walked those final minutes beside her maintained total silence, refusing even to answer questions about his own parents' names, protected by nothing more sophisticated than a consistent, unbroken refusal to speak, a strategy that worked, in the narrowest possible legal sense, for almost a quarter of a century before it finally stopped working at all. Her body, despite a conviction, a sentencing, 2 full trials, and a Supreme Court appeal finally exhausted in 2026, has still never been recovered, buried somewhere, moved at some point from that clandestine grave beneath a deck, and never found again despite decades of searches, excavations, ground-penetrating radar, and cadaver dogs. Her family got a verdict. They got a sentence, a judge's blunt public condemnation, and a conviction that has now survived every appeal available to challenge it. They never got their daughter back. Not even enough of her to finally, physically, lay her to rest. And that absence, more than any single piece of evidence or courtroom testimony, remains the one part of this entire 25-year case that no verdict has ever been able to resolve. Rest in peace, Kristen Smart. See you in the next case.